Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. I'm excited to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Professor Brian Powell. Professor Powell is the James H. Rudy Professor of Sociology and the co-director of the Preparing Future Faculty Program in the Department of Sociology here at Indiana University. His research focuses on family, education, gender, and sexuality. He is an award-winning scholar, teacher, and author, and will discuss his forthcoming book, Who Should Pay? Higher Education, Responsibility, and the Public, which is co-authored by IU Ph.D. Natasha Quidlin. Following his presentation, Professor Powell will be joined by Sociology Ph.D. student Callie Cleckner for the audience Q&A session. Ms. Cleckner's research focuses on education, race, and mixed research methods. She is also an associate instructor for sociology, the liberal arts and management program. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Powell for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's really good to present today at the very last Food for Thought. I must confess, I didn't even know about this event until a few months ago. And it's a shame because I went through the list of all the presentations I missed, and which now are still available. And I'm really impressed by the range of faculty presentations that the college has sponsored in this important event. I missed Thanksgiving last week. I got sick. Got tested for COVID. It wasn't that, it was just a regular COVID. And so I ended up not having Thanksgiving with friends or with relatives. And usually when I have these events, when I usually have dinner with, especially with my relatives, we end up with a game sort of in which relatives ask me, well, what are you studying now? And they say, and they know since I study public opinion, they ask me, well, ask me one of the questions from your survey. So I'd like to start this presentation by doing exactly the same thing. Now, let me just share the screen. Okay, so here's the question I want you to answer. Who should have the main responsibility for the cost of education beyond high school? Should it be the students? Should it be the parents? Should it be the state or local government? Or should it be the federal government? Now, I know some of you are going to respond as a lot of the people we interviewed, oh, this is too broad a question. I don't know what it means. What does it mean? And so I'm going to give you the same recommendation that we do in our interviews, whatever it means to you. Who should have the main responsibility for the cost of education beyond high school? This question, let me ask you then, this question along with several other questions serve as the core of my book, our book, Who Should Pay? Higher Education, Responsibility, and the Public. And when I say our, I mean Natasha Quidlin, who earned her PhD at Indiana University and now is a professor at UCLA and was part of my research team, and me. In addition, 3 former graduate students also contributed chapters in this book. Emma Cohen, who is at the American Institutes for Research, Oren Pizimoni-Levy, Teachers College, Columbia University, and finally, Emily Meanwell, who fortunately remains at Indiana University. In this book, we ask the question, who should pay? It's a very simple question. Higher education, who is responsible? And our interest is public views about who really should be responsible for the funding of college. In this case, when we think about this issue, this topic of higher education and paying for college is ubiquitous. Wherever you go, there are actually all these different discussions on it. As someone who's done research and doing research on the topic now, I can't help but notice all these cases in terms of movies, in terms of TV shows, in which there's cases of parents sacrificing for their children, children trying to find unique ways to support themselves through college. We even see the prevalence of concerns about funding for college in advice columns. These were from several advice columns in the past few years. And you just see this repeated question about who should pay. Dear Abby, Dad says girls must pay their own way at college. A different Dear Abby, daughter gives everything, given everything gives heartache in return. And given everything basically was about how they sacrificed so she can go to college. Man tells parents they're obligated to help pay for their children's education. Parents wonder if they should pay son's tuition. New York Times also has an advice column, The Ethicist, on Sunday, and they have slightly more unique titles, but they're still relevant to the issue for today. My parents paid for my education. Does that mean I need to take a soul-crushing job? And can I lie to my father about being gay so he will pay for my college education? The response in the column by at least one of the ethicists is, yes, it is reasonable for you to be dishonest to your father. I'm not so sure about that, but the point about this is all of these columns deal with this issue, this debate about this presumption that parents should be responsible for their children and should be responsible for the funding of college. However, if we go further and we think about what's going on today, we realize that this is not necessarily a possibility for parents or for children. What we know right now is that the cost of education keeps on going up and up and up. And this is true in private schools, and it's also relevant for today's talk in public schools. You know, I'm really proud to be at Indiana University as a public university, a university that is available for people throughout the state and beyond. And when I arrived at Indiana University, the estimate I understand was about half of the college costs were actually covered by the state government. Now, decades later, the figure is less than 20% or 15%. And Indiana is not necessarily the lowest in contributions to universities. Some universities, in effect, have now been finding so many other sources other than the government to support college that calling certain universities even a public university doesn't make sense. They're de facto private universities. Now, the view about who should be responsible for funding goes beyond the issue of advice columns or movies. We see it also, it's just been in the discourse among politicians. I just want to show you a couple of quotes by some politicians who were running for public office in the past 10 years. And I just want to show you sort of like the array of views that are out there. For those who are needy, there's an old-fashioned remedy that's very effective called work. In fact, work might be beneficial for those who are needy. It certainly provided some valuable experiences for me. This was a politician who basically says there should not be any governmental support, and in fact, the responsibility for funding should be on the student. Another politician basically said the support for college should be all individualized because welders make more money than philosophers. We need more welders and less philosophers. And when I saw the list of people who signed up today, I did notice there is a philosophy professor in the group. So if they're here, you can respond. A very different view, not so different actually, is get the federal government out of education altogether. On the other side of the debate, we see people who talk about issues regarding affordability. Higher education must become affordable for all. We have a crisis in higher education today. Today, many of our young people cannot afford a college education, and those who are leaving are faced with crushing debt. You have kids in the 5th or 6th grade who understand that no matter how hard they try, how well they do in school, they're never going to make it in college because their families don't have the money. But when we say to those children in America, you're going to be able to go to college, that is a revolution. Others take sort of an in-between position. Here's one. I believe we should make community college free. We should have debt-free college if you go to a public university. But I disagree with free college for everybody. I don't think taxpayers should be paying to send, and this person gave a name of a wealthy person's kid to go to college. I think it ought to be a compact. Families contribute, kids contribute. Others go further and they talk about the global economy. And they talk about how in the global economy, the most valuable skill you can sell is your knowledge. Finally, if we're serious about making sure that America's workers and America itself succeeds in the 21st century, the single most important step we can take is to make sure that every one of your young people has the best education that the world has to offer. Now, we talk about media, we talk about what the funding situation is, we talk about politicians, but where is the public? What does the public think about issues of higher education? Where do they place responsibility for the funding of college? Now, I've been studying public opinion for quite a while, and my position is a really simple: public opinion matters. There's a great deal of debate to the extent to which public opinion matters, but we know that in general, public opinion both reflects and shapes social policies. For example, I don't think it is a coincidence that former President Obama's views about same-sex marriage changed, quote, evolved, precisely when public opinion showed that over half of Americans were in favor of same-sex marriage. It is not a coincidence that the legalization of marijuana that's going on in many states has occurred as public opinion in favor of legalization of marijuana has increased. We know there are lots of exceptions. In fact, the Supreme Court case yesterday suggests a very likely exception coming up. But public opinion is a critical point for us to understand higher education. So what we did, I wanted to know, what do Americans think about the funding of college? Where do they place the responsibility for funding college? A series of other questions. I want to tell you a little bit about how we collected the data, because it speaks also to the opportunities that the College of Arts and Science in Indiana University provides for its undergraduates and graduate students. The first two waves of my study were conducted as part of the sociological research practicum, and it was known as the Constructing the Family and Higher Education Survey. This practicum basically is an opportunity for first-year graduate students in sociology and undergraduates in sociology and throughout the college to be part of a research team. And as part of the research team, in my case, they were involved in conducting interviews. Some of them were involved in coding data. Some of them were involved with meeting with me to discuss the different types of patterns. But the point of the project was to expose students to how research is done and to talk about the dirtiness and the challenges of collecting data. I think this is one of the best opportunities for graduate students and undergraduates on campus, and I'm glad that our department continues to do it. We conducted surveys with the assistance of the Center for Survey Research at Indiana University. And the Center for Survey Research has been involved in many major surveys, for Indiana University professors and beyond. And the Center for Survey Research was involved in training the graduate students and undergraduates how to conduct surveys. We conducted interviews in 2010 and 2015. And we ended up with 831 respondents in one year, 847 respondents in the other year. And this was a national sample. The national sample we reached via landline and cell phones. Now, doing phone interviews has become increasingly challenging. And so we stopped conducting cell phone and landline phone interviews, at least my research team, in 2015. But in 2010 and 2015, we also asked a series of questions, closed-ended questions, such as the question I asked you at the very beginning, and open-ended questions that basically asked, why do you believe that students or parents or the state government or the federal government should be responsible? But so we have a lot of information, not only about what their responses were, but why they believe certain things. And those open-ended responses, especially when you have 1,600 responses, this can be very, very useful. In 2019, we moved from phone interviews to what's known as panel surveys. And these are online surveys. And we conducted those. We had over about 1,500 cases using an organization called Qualtrics. There is a difference between using phone interviews and panel data. And so I'm not going to focus that much on the 2019 data, other than to show you what patterns have happened since 2019. Now, one thing I should note about the interviews is, especially because we taped every interview and we had open-ended responses, we were able to gauge not only what they were saying, but also the emotions that were coming out of their interviews. Now, I've conducted surveys before on issues regarding same-sex marriage and definitions of family, and I expected to see very emotional responses there. I didn't anticipate that there'd be as emotional responses to these types of questions as well. Let me give you just one quote. And this was one response at the very beginning of the survey. And he said, look, we are a Black family living on supplemental income from another family. And no matter what I do, I know my kids will not have the opportunity to make it a higher education. We can't afford it. Now, this was the way he said it was a very emotional type of response. And it really spoke to the issue that we're interested in. How do we make education available, accessible to everybody? So let's go back now to the question I asked you. Who should have the main responsibility for the cost of education beyond high school? Students, parents, state, or federal government? These are the responses from 2010. And I should note one thing about these responses. Just as you may have said, oh, I can't give one answer. People said that, and then they gave an answer. And the patterns are very clear. Primary responsibility in 2010 was placed on parents. Second, then followed by students. And the government was mentioned by 18% of the people, or less than 1/5. One really interesting side note is more people said the federal government than the state government. But when you looked at regions in the United States, there was a really different pattern. What we found, for example, is in the West Coast and also in the Midwest, people were more likely to say the state government than the federal government is their top choice. Whereas in the Northeast and the East Coast, people were overwhelmingly more likely to say they chose government, federal government instead of state government. I think this speaks to the omnipresence of private colleges throughout the Northeast. And it also speaks to how powerful public universities continue to be in terms of people's views about education in the Midwest and the West Coast. Now, this question, I didn't come up with this question. The question came from a survey that was originally conducted in 1980. And this was from high school and beyond. This was collected by the National Center for Educational Statistics. And in the late 80s, I wrote a few articles about these data, about sponsoring the next generation. And I want to point one interesting pattern. And the pattern basically is the parents were considered the ones most likely responsible, as in 2010, students less so. But really importantly to us, exactly the same percentage of people said the state, local, or federal government, 18% said they should be primarily responsible. In other words, between 1980 and 2010, and admittedly, the surveys are a little different, but the questions are the same. we have exactly the same response. Now, when I got these patterns, and when I first started working on a paper based on these patterns, it seemed to me that the storyline that I had was that basically Americans' values regarding education are sticky. They do not change. However, that pattern may well have changed, but we'll get to that in a moment. We also asked the question, and this was not asked in high school and beyond, who should be the second most responsible for the cost of education beyond high school? Now, the reason I asked that question is because several of you are probably thinking, well, it's not just one group, another group should be responsible as well. And we are really interested in how people clustered their top choice and their second choice. And we conceptualize the clusters in one of three ways. For some people, they viewed college funding as a private responsibility. And that would be people who chose parents as their first choice or students as their first choice, and parents or students as their second choice. In other words, funding should be based on the individual, be the individual student or the individual parent. There's a different group, and this is the one at the bottom. College is a public responsibility. That is, funding should be by the government, the state and local government and the federal government, one being the first, one being the second, regardless of order. And then there's a third group, and I think this group is the really interesting group. And this is a group that views college funding as a shared responsibility. It's the idea that there should be a partnership or a compact or a contract between the government and individuals, whether it's the government and parents or the student and government. So what we then did was look at what was the combination of these responses, what's the distribution of scores. In 2010, we found that 2/3 of Americans chose, 65% said parents and students or students and parents. And with the lowest being 9% saying the state government and the federal government. This is a pattern that basically said that the vast majority of people see funding of college as primarily an individual responsibility. So 2015, I asked the same questions. And I was really interested in assessing the extent to which the stickiness of values that I saw between 1980 and 2010 continued. And I was fully expecting there'd be very little change. I was completely wrong. Here's the pattern about main responsibility. You see some slight decreases for parents and for students, but cumulatively that meant that there was a dramatic increase from 18% to 31%, almost a third, saying that the government should be responsible. This is a huge change. Public opinion in general does not change. It doesn't change that quickly. It's even more noticeable if we look at the combinations. In the combinations, it used to be that 65%, 2/3 of Americans said parents and students. It has now been brought down to the 50-50 mark. In contrast, all other groups, the other groups have then increased. Government from 9% to 19%, and parents from 16% to 20%. But what this has changed from a very clear position where the majority of Americans saw funding as an individual responsibility to a more polarized position in which half of the people think that funding should be purely individualized, and the other half saying the government at least should be involved either partially or completely. The pattern changes even more in 2019. In 2019, we see a dramatic decline in terms of parents and a dramatic increase in terms of government. And if we look at it in terms of combinations, you see the pattern continue to go down. Now, I should caution, as I mentioned before, we used a very different type of data set. We used panel surveys. We did every possible statistical adjustment to make sure that the differences are not the result of it simply being a different type of survey. So we're pretty confident about these patterns, and the pattern is suggesting a remarkable shift in time between 2010 and 2019. Now, these are the changes over time. I want to very briefly talk about differences by social groups. And I want to focus on just a few of them, because I imagine some people are thinking, well, who are the people who are more likely to be in favor of a privatized model or of a collective model? So I want to start off with racial differences, because this was one of the most noticeable differences out there. And what we see here is a pattern, and this is for the patterns. These are data from 2010 and 2015. And what we see here for the 62% figure is that 62% of white Americans in our sample from 2010 and 2015 together think that parents and students should be responsible. You see that pattern, you don't see that pattern for Black respondents, Asian respondents, or Latinx respondents. Instead, what you see is that the most common response is some type of partnership between students and government, or even more notable, parents and government. Or to put it differently, white respondents, and this is what we also got from our open-ended comments, white respondents are more likely to say that parents and students jointly have the job of funding college, whereas Black, Asian, and Latinx respondents say that the job for funding should be the government or parents, and the job of students is not to fund. The job of students is to be a good student. That is their responsibility. Age differences also are very interesting. And these differences surprised us a little bit. And I'm just gonna, this pattern may make a lot of sense. Younger adults are more likely than any other group to say that government should be responsible. And people 65 and above are most likely to say parents and students are responsible. This might give the impression that basically students are thinking they shouldn't be responsible and others should be responsible. But I want to look at the main responses that they gave. In terms of main responsibility, we see an interesting pattern. And the pattern is, yes, they are more likely than the other group to say government should be responsible. But notice also, they're the least likely to say that parents are responsible. So we often talk about the entitled student who thinks that their parents and others should be responsible. They are not seeing parents as primarily responsible. In fact, the percentage who say students themselves should be responsible is pretty much the same as those who are 30 to 44 and those who are 45 to 64. In our interviews, what we found is that quite a few people in the 18 to 29-year range said students are responsible because students are adults. And it's really interesting, this idea that they were more likely to invoke the idea of responsibility as we are adults and therefore we are responsible. And this is very counter to a lot of the public discourse about young adults. Let's skip this. Other differences. I'm just going to mention very briefly these other differences. Gender differences. You might think, and we debated, my team debated about what gender differences we might find. Are women more likely to say that parents are responsible? Are they more likely to say that governments are responsible? You could come up with good explanations for that. Women may be thinking parents should be taking care of their children. You might be thinking that men are more likely to privilege individual student independence. But men also might be privileging the idea that families, or in particular fathers, should be responsible for providing for their children. It ends up being a wash. we found no difference across gender. In terms of education, we also had competing expectations. You might think that people who don't have a college degree would be more likely to say that individuals should be paying for the college because they're the ones who are benefiting. We don't have a college degree. Why should we be supporting them? On the other hand, people without a college degree might also be saying, if there were governmental support, perhaps my children would be more likely to be able to go to college. By the same token, people with a college degree might see college as being very important, as just understand the value of education and believe that education should be made available for everybody. But there's an alternative view, and this is known as opportunity hoarding. And opportunity hoarding means that those who have whatever resources you're talking about don't necessarily want other people to have it. And so education could go in either direction. And what we found, once again, is that there was no major difference by education. I won't talk about income, parenthood, and religion right now, but if any of you have questions about it, I'd be glad to go back to it. So in the book, Who Should Pay?, we also ask several other questions. We have chapters around this. One chapter is, why should they pay? And this is a chapter that asks people to explain their answers. And there are multiple themes that people talk about regarding parenting, regarding students, regarding government. And I'd be glad to answer any questions on that. A different chapter focuses on the specific question of free tuition. Should college be free? What we find in our interviews is that the vast majority of people believe that tuition should be free for qualified students in public universities. That's consistent with almost every survey that's been done. However, when we ask people why they believe it, we found that there was a little more nuance to it and a little more complexity. That is, a lot of people would say, I believe college tuition should be free, and then say, but I think students should pay too, which doesn't sound like college is free. Or college should be free, but only for people who can't afford it. Interestingly, the people who said college should not be free, they also had a no but as well. They often say, no, it shouldn't be free, but we should do something to make it available for more people. The next chapter asks about people's views about accessibility. That is, do they think college really is within reach to everybody, and why not? And finally, we asked a chapter whether or not people view college as worth it. Do you need a college degree to be successful? Are the returns to college worth the cost? The answers, at first blush, appears that people are pretty negative about college. And then when we look through the data and look through the answers, we realize that even people who express ambivalence about whether you really need college almost all of them end up indicating that they believe that college provides advantages that not having college does not provide. So these are just some other questions that we asked within the study, in the book. So I guess I should conclude by saying, buy the book or think of some questions. At the end of the presentation, my email address is listed, and I really encourage and welcome anybody to contact me and ask me any questions you have. At this point, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to have Callie Cleckner, who is a wonderful graduate student in our department who's studying issues of education, among other topics, will be serving as moderator.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of your research, though, I was hoping that you could tell us about what's been most meaningful to you here at IU. I know you've been a professor quite a while.
Forever.
Yeah. So I was hoping you could share with us some of your experience that's been meaningful.
Oh, wow. Well, I arrived at Indiana University in the mid-1980s, and I arrived as a postdoctoral fellow. I earned my Ph.D. at Emory University in Atlanta. Before then, I lived in Washington, D.C. Before then, I lived in New York. And then when I grew up on a small farm in New York, but I viewed myself as an urban person who lives somewhere on the East. So when I took the postdoc at Indiana University, it was a shock for me in terms of where I was going to. And when I arrived, the chair of the department met with me in our very first conversation. And he said, Brian, I want you to know we have never hired a postdoc to be a faculty member, and we never will. And I, in turn, said to the chair, I have no intention of being in Bloomington, Indiana for more than 2 years. He changed his mind, the department changed its mind, I changed my mind, and I'm really glad. Indiana University has been, I know it sounds like a cliche to say that there is a community or it is a family, but my sense of the university, the way the university has been, is that it really has been a place where I feel real connection, and a real connection with other faculty members, yes, even with administrators, and especially with students. When I arrived here, the students I taught at Emory University were, as a general rule, pretty wealthy. It was a private college. I think it cost $70,000 a year to go there now. There wasn't as much financial aid back then. And it was a non-diverse, it was a wealthy, non-diverse group of students. They were students with, great talents. They came in really, really prepared, and I really enjoyed it. And I also enjoyed the fact that those classes were really small. I mean, my largest class was maybe 30 students. I arrive at Indiana University, it's completely different. First thing is, among my first classes is Ballantine Hall 013. If you're an alum, you may well have been in one of that classroom. 360, I think it was 364 students when I taught there. It's a completely different world. And one thing I discovered is, even in a class of 360 students, I could individualize it, and I could get to actually know a lot of students. And I sort of prided myself on my memory. I'm not sure I have that memory now, but I prided myself on the memory of getting to know pretty much everyone in the class. And also knowing that these students come from such different backgrounds. Some students who, Bloomington is the biggest town they ever was in. A university that is just gigantic, so huge that it's so easy to get lost. Other students who come from other countries, for whom this is their experience in the United States. Students who are struggling to figure out how to survive college. And at the same time, students who are just absolutely brilliant students who could be successful in any university, and they're here and they come here. And I really feel very lucky that I've been able to work with such a wide range of students and get a sense and really feel very connected to them. And to this day, I mean, I hear from many students, and it really feels like a real connection. I didn't even mention graduate students. I imagine Callie may be smiling on it. The connection to graduate students is maybe even more palpable. And I really feel that Indiana University, for me, has been very special in this regard.
Thank you. So next, somebody from the audience, Laura, is interested in hearing more about why you think public.
I just lost you, Callie. So I think the question is, why did public opinion shift over time? And so there's several reasons for that. And some of it is from our interviews. One thing we noticed between 2010 and 2015 was a huge number of people who talked about college debt. And I think this is a spillover effect of the recession of 2008. You would think they'd be noticing already by 2010, but this was a continuous factor. In 2010, very few people mentioned college debt. In 2015, all these people were talking about staggering debt. They're talking about, as we mentioned, a politician said crushing debt. There was a person who said crushing debt. And I really think that is one of the reasons. I think there's another reason, and that is Obamacare, the ACA. For years, we had heard that health insurance is a private issue. This is an individual responsibility. And with the ACA, with Obamacare, we shifted it to say that no, the government needs to be involved, that the government, either by itself or in partnership with individuals, can be providing support. And in fact, several people in our interviews explicitly were talking about that change. So I think those are two of the key reasons for the change.
And then, so we have another question. Jim asks, in a world where shelter, food, and medicine is available only to people who can pay, why would you think people who would treat education any differently? And I know you just mentioned something about the Affordable Care Act. I don't know if that also applies to this question.
Yeah, when we talk about education, we can talk about different types of resources that are available or not available to people in the world and in the United States. The truth is that there's certain areas in which the government has provided support. Or to put it differently, we do pay for elementary school, public school. We do pay for secondary school. One could ask the question, why are we paying for that? I mean, the reality is that that education is indeed one of the most effective ways, individually and collectively, for a society and for individuals to advance. And to the extent that we believed that you needed a high school degree 50 years ago to be successful, in all likelihood, that same argument should be able to be extended to college students, to having a college degree today.
And then, so based on all of your research, based on a whole career on research, what are the things that you have found, the events, the factors that tend to cause public opinions to change?
And I see it's Gerald. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'm very glad I'm asked the toughest question by one of my favorite former students. There are several reasons for changes in public opinion. Sometimes there can simply be a shock to the system. There can be just simply a shock to the system. For example, the recession in 2008, was a shock to the system. I think COVID is a shock to the system, and we haven't quite figured out how is that going to shift public opinion. I should note, we did ask the survey again in 2020 during the middle of the pandemic, and it doesn't look like that the pandemic shifted the pattern that was continuing, because it just keeps on continuing with people moving slightly towards more of a government, slightly away from an individual response. But a shock to the system can be one thing. There are other factors that can play a role. I mean, one factor that can play a role is the role of, and I know Gerald's really interested in this issue, the issues of media. Media and public discourse can have an impact on public opinion. Let me just give you the example in terms of public opinion regarding the definitions of family and whether same-sex couples count as family and whether they should get married. It is amazing to see what is in media today showcasing same-sex couples. And you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you see very different changes. I don't want to say Will and Grace is responsible for changes in views about same-sex couples, but Will and Grace, along with a series of TV shows, probably played a more critical role in how we think about same-sex couples than we speak to it. I know in our interviews, people would talk about TV shows. One person, for example, talking about how she watched a show in which Lynn Cheney, the wife of the former vice president, was talking about her daughter. And in the interview, this person was saying, that really played a role for me. So I think media can play a role, shocks to the system can play a role, and I think there can be spillover effects from other things. I do believe I mean, the fact that so many people had mentioned medical care and Obamacare and then linked it to college really, I think, is a powerful explanation, is critical, maybe a very critical factor for the change.
Thank you. So did your survey ask any follow-up questions, such as how should the government raise funds to pay for all of this? Or did survey respondents ask about what can be done to rein in the cost of education that is being charged by colleges and universities?
I think that's a really important question. What we did is we let people talk, period. We didn't want to go into the issues of how funding will occur, but people brought it up, and people, but the most interesting pattern regarding funding was a large number of people sort of flipped the argument. Instead of saying, well, if we fund college, this is going to increase taxes, what people said instead was, we pay taxes, we should be getting something concrete from it. And so ironically, that people were using the financial argument, basically saying taxes are spent on all these things that are not benefiting us. College is something that would benefit us. And so a lot of people surprisingly flipped the argument to basically say, government should be paying for college and helping out because we already pay so many taxes. Those people did not say where you would cut expenses, but they give this argument.
So related to that, did anyone say that education is a public good and that was the primary reason that governments were explicit?
Yeah. When we looked at the reasons people talked about why the government should be responsible, they basically talked about three issues. They talked about affordability. They say things are not affordable, so the government should be involved. Other people talked about countries and pointed out how the United States lagged behind a lot of other countries that provide college funding. Of course, some of these countries are much more exclusive in its acceptance of students, but they talked about, and so some people actually talked about, I have a cousin who lives in Norway, and they get funding. But the most important one that people talked about was that college was a collective good, that society benefits as a result of more people being in college. And so this was mentioned quite a bit in 2010. So in 2015, we actually asked a closed-ended question and asked, how important is a college degree for the college student? How important is a college-educated population for the country? And we compared those, and what we found is that a huge number of people said this is very important for the college student and very important for society. And it was the group that says college education is not that important for society, which was the ones least likely to say the government should be involved.
And then did anyone cite the fact that many new jobs now require a bachelor's degree instead of a high school diploma?
Yeah. In fact, this is one of the common, again, I want to put it in perspective. We had hundreds of responses and we coded every single response. And many people did talk about how a high school degree today is just not enough. How a high school degree is not going to provide the skills you need to do well. Now, I should note that other people gave the plumber's welder argument. You don't need a college degree for that. And that's true. But many people basically talked about the types of jobs that we have today require a college degree. And at least one person, I remember one quote in particular, and this is something you will hear deans of colleges say, that the jobs of the future that we don't even know about yet will require a college degree.
And then John asked about the rise of college education, cost of college education, which you've addressed a little bit already. But I was also curious about this issue in thinking about the rise after 2010, because the cost of college has been going up for decades, right? Not just in the last 10 years. So I'm interested in how you think that dynamic is kind of entangled with one another.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two different issues of cost of education. There's the rise of cost of education in the private schools and the rise of cost of education in public schools. I'm going to put away the private schools because I will tell you most of the people in our interviews, they were thinking of public schools. And I think public schools is, more people go to public schools than private schools. Private schools still represent, some of the elite schools people think about, but that's not where the action is in terms of college. I think there are multiple factors involved in why colleges become more expensive. But I will give you what I think is probably the most policy related one. And that is governments have cut their support for college. State governments have cut their support for college. And, simple as that. Suppose something costs $100 and years ago, the state paid $50 and now they're paying only $15. Who's going to pay that $35 difference? This is one of the critical factors for the increase in expenses. The state support for college has gone down. Indiana is not the worst on it, but this has been mostly a national change. And I will say, with the Great Recession, education was one of the first things to be cut. And some states, including Indiana, has been trying to compensate for it since. But we're still, when it used to be that there was a great deal of government support, and now there's so little support, that can be a critical factor. Now, this is not to deny other factors going on. Colleges trying to, and I think in many ways needing to, be more supportive of the great variations of experiences that students that students who enter or face, providing different types of support programs. And those type of things and other types of changes may be critical. But I think one of the critical factor is, in effect, state support for public schools.
And we probably only have time for one more question. Were you able to do any statistical analysis on these group differences? And I'm also curious about the racial group differences, if you have any explanations on the patterns that you saw, if you have anything that you've come up with so far.
Yeah, well, of course we did statistical difference. Everything is tested statistically. The patterns I talked about regarding racial differences are statistically significant. Now, what are the, and I should note, by the way, this pattern may not actually be that surprising to, at least I wrote an article several decades ago, which was a play on the title was a play on a Spike Lee movie. It was called Doing the Right Thing. And basically what we found in effect was, in terms of that racial minorities were less likely to place responsibility on students to fund college. And I really think it is a question of, many racial minorities seeing education as a way out. This is not saying that white parents or white adults don't see it as a means to success, but the discourse of education as the route out has been a very prominent part of Black discourse and a very prominent part of the experiences of immigrants. And so it's not that surprising. In fact, I told these patterns to a friend of mine whose parents owned a Chinese restaurant, and they said, well, of course, that's going to be the case. Parents, and governments are going to be the ones who should be helping the child, so the child should be working hard and doing as well as possible in college. So I think it resonates in many, many ways on that.
Right. And then one final question or statement, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you pay nothing, it's worth nothing. Part pay with government help is the answer. I'm not going to disagree. it may be clear what my position is on these things, or may not be clear what my position is on this. I'm really interested in what public opinion is. If public opinion is not the opinion I have, it's not the opinion I have. The response that was given just now is a response that many parents, many people talked about. Many people talked about the idea that students need to have skin in the game. That if they're not responsible for some part of funding, then they're not going to get any value out of it. Of course, the extension of that argument then should be that all students, regardless of their parents' ability to pay for college, should be paying for college. And that's not what we have today. And so I don't necessarily disagree that there should be compact. I think if I answered the question, I would say I don't want to answer the question. I think all parties should be involved to some degree. But fortunately, I get to ask the question as opposed to answer it.
Well, thank you so much. On that, I'm going to turn things back to Vanessa for a few closing remarks.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us and participating in tonight's live stream. I would like to thank Professor Powell and Ms. Cleckner for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to thank the IU Alumni Association and its members for assisting with tonight's program. Additionally, finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.